I found a hidden camera inside my own home on a Tuesday morning in November, and it changed everything I thought I knew about my family. I'd been meaning to replace the battery in the smoke detector above my office desk for 3 weeks. The amber blink every 30 seconds had become background noise, easy to ignore when you live alone. That Tuesday, I finally climbed the stepladder, unscrewed the housing, and stopped. A camera lens the size of a shirt button stared back at me from inside the plastic casing, angled precisely downward, toward my desk, toward the gray steel safe in the corner where I kept my pension documents, Helen's jewelry, and 30 years of financial records. I'd spent 38 years as a county fire marshal before I retired, 6 years in the Army before that. I knew concealment work when I saw it. Clean installation, no fingerprints, the housing replaced at exactly the factory angle. Whoever put this here had done it before and done it carefully. Only 2 people had been in this office recently. My neighbor Earl, who came by last month to return a socket wrench and never made it past the kitchen. And my son-in-law, who'd visited 6 weeks ago to help me upgrade the smart home system, his words. He'd spent 3 hours in this office alone while I made lunch. Said he was configuring the thermostat remote access. Said I'd thank him for it when winter hit. I stood on that ladder and looked at the lens for a long time. I didn't touch it. An old investigator's instinct. Never show your hand until you know all the cards. I screwed the housing back on at the same angle, climbed down, and walked to the kitchen. I put the kettle on and sat at the table where Helen and I had eaten breakfast together for 31 years. And I thought, before I tell you what happened next, let me ask you something. Drop a comment below, where are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? I want to know how far this story is reaching. I'd lived alone in Maryville, Tennessee for 2 years, ever since Helen passed from pancreatic cancer in the fall of 2022. My daughter had taken her mother's death hard. She and my son-in-law had been married just under a year when Helen died, and I watched grief do something complicated to my daughter, soften her in some places, make her lean on her husband in ways I didn't fully understand but didn't question. She needed someone steady. He was there. My son-in-law was a commercial real estate broker. Polished, confident in the way men get when they've never been told no enough times. He remembered your coffee order and forgot to look you in the eye. I'd never said any of that to my daughter. He made her laugh, and for a long while that had been enough for me. After Helen died, he started calling more, visiting more. There were dinners where he'd steer the conversation toward my finances casually, the way a fisherman trails a line and waits. Had I thought about estate planning? Did I know an advisor could be growing my pension in ways I hadn't considered? I answered in generalities and changed the subject. I'd built a careful life. I wasn't in the habit of explaining it to people who hadn't helped me build it. The smart home visit 6 weeks ago had been his idea entirely. Dad, let me do this for you. My daughter worries about you out here alone. This way we can check the thermostat, the porch lights, make sure everything's running. I let him in because my daughter did worry, and because I had no reason then to suspect anything beyond a son-in-law working too hard to be liked. 3 hours in my office. I'd made sandwiches. Now I sat at my kitchen table and the kettle started to scream. I poured my coffee and made a decision the same way I'd made decisions in burning buildings for 38 years. Identify what you know, identify what you don't, and don't move until you're ready to move completely. I would not confront him. Not yet. What I would do was observe, collect, and document, then act. That afternoon, I drove to the hardware store in Earl's pickup, not mine, in case someone was monitoring my movements, and bought a signal detector. The kind you can find at any security store. Back home, I swept the entire house. Found 3 devices. The smoke detector above my desk, a small unit behind the bookcase in the living room, pressed against the baseboard and disguised as a plug-in air freshener. And a third one I almost missed wedged behind the frame of Helen's portrait in the hallway, pointed at the front door. 3 cameras. Not a worried son-in-law checking on the old man. Systematic surveillance. I photographed each one before I touched them. Then I called Earl Dawson. Earl was my neighbor of 19 years. 71, retired electrician, the kind of man who shows up with his truck and doesn't ask questions he doesn't want answered. I knocked on his back door at 4 in the afternoon. Earl, I said, I need to borrow your chicken coop for a few days. He looked at me. My chicken coop. I need to point something at your Rhode Island Reds. He was quiet for a moment. You want coffee first? Please. An hour later, the camera from above my desk was mounted inside Earl's coop, aimed at a dozen hens pecking at their feed. The other two I left in place, no reason to reveal everything at once. The living room and hallway cameras would keep broadcasting my empty house, but the one that had been staring at my safe was now 30 yards away, watching chickens. I went home and cooked dinner. I ate slowly. I kept my phone on the table, volume all the way up. At 9:14 that night, my son-in-law called. "Hey, Walt. Too casual, the performance of casual. Just checking in. How's everything going?" "Fine," I said. "Quiet evening." "You home? Staying warm out there?" I set down my fork. "Where else would I be?" Right. My daughter just wanted to make sure you were comfortable. You know how she worries." A pause that lasted half a beat too long. "Everything in the office okay? The thermostat system working the way it should? Not how are you feeling? Not how's your back? The office. The thermostat he'd installed 6 weeks ago and had never once asked about since." "Everything's fine," I said. "Good night." After I hung up, I sat at the table for a long time. He'd called to confirm I was home, which meant he'd been watching, which meant the moment I'd moved that camera to Earl's coop, he'd seen the footage shift from my office to a dozen chickens, and now he was trying to figure out what had happened without revealing that he'd been watching it all. The question was no longer whether my son-in-law was up to something. The question was how far it had already gone. Thursday morning, I went to see my old Army friend Dave, who'd run the same pharmacy on Kingston Pike for 22 years. I trusted him the way you trust someone who's seen you at your worst, and never brought it up again. "Dave," I said, "pull my prescription history. Everything for the past year." He typed for a minute. Then he stopped, looked at the screen, looked at me. "Walt," he said carefully, "who called this in?" "My metoprolol blood pressure medication. I'd been on 25 milligrams daily for 4 years. According to Dave's system, a prescription change request had been phoned in 11 weeks ago. New dosage, 100 milligrams, 4 times my current amount. I had not called it in. My doctor had not called it in. I had not picked up any new prescription because I hadn't known one existed. But someone had tried. The pharmacist on duty flagged it," Dave said quietly. "A jump that large without a physician's note attached, she held it pending confirmation. Nobody ever followed up. I sat with that. 100 milligrams of metoprolol in a 4-year-old man who'd been on a quarter of that dose for years. At that level, severe dizziness, dangerously low blood pressure, fainting, a fall down the porch steps, a car leaving the road on the way to town. At my age, with my history, nobody would look twice. It would be exactly what it appeared to be an old man's body finally giving out." Dave was watching me. "You need to tell me what's happening." "Give me until Monday," I said. That evening, I went 3 houses down to Jim Carey, retired county attorney, man I'd known for 15 years, and sat at his kitchen table with a USB drive containing everything I documented. The camera photos, the prescription record, a timeline written out by hand. Jim read through it slowly, the way lawyers read everything, like the words might rearrange themselves if he moved too fast. "There has to be a financial motive," he said when he finished. "Something he's positioned to take." I asked to use his computer. My life insurance account. A whole life policy Helen and I had built together over 22 years. I'd never updated the beneficiary after my daughter's marriage. Her name had been on it since she was 17. What I found on the screen was her name alongside her husband's, joint primary, added 8 months ago. Equal shares. I had never authorized that addition. My signature was on file. I had not signed anything. Jim looked at the screen behind me, said nothing for a moment. Then he searched the county property records. A home equity line of credit against my property. 3 months ago. Borrower. Walter James Briggs. Current balance drawn. $265,000. My house had been paid off for 11 years. I had never applied for a HELOC. I had never signed a guarantee. I drove home through the dark. $265,000, taken from equity I hadn't known, was touched. A beneficiary change I hadn't made. A prescription that could have sent me to the ground looking like natural causes. He'd been building it for months, layer by layer, and the cameras were his early warning system to know the moment I started asking questions, so he'd have time to finish or to run. What he hadn't anticipated was Earl's chickens. I didn't sleep. At 2 a.m., I called Carl Whitmore, a retired FBI agent I'd worked arson cases with back when our jurisdictions overlapped. He answered on the third ring, voice clear in the way of men who never completely stop working. "What's wrong?" he said. "My son-in-law has been stealing from me," I said, "and I believe he tried to arrange for me to die of natural causes. I have documentation." A pause. "How complete is your documentation?" "It's on a USB drive in my shirt pocket." 8 o'clock tomorrow, my office. I spread everything across Carl's conference table the next morning. He worked through it without interrupting, with the focused stillness of a man who'd sat across from people who'd done worse things than this. When he finished, he said, "The prescription attempt is what concerns me most." "Me too. Because the rest of this is prison time, but survivable." "A man who researches how to adjust your medication to cause a cardiac event, Walt. That's a man who's thought through killing you and decided he prefers something that doesn't look like killing." I already knew this, but hearing it said clearly by someone else made it land in a new way. Carl connected me with 2 agents from the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. If I was willing to record a conversation, he said, we could build a case that wouldn't fall apart in a courtroom. What I needed my son-in-law to confirm on tape, that he had access to my home and documents, that he'd made financial decisions using my name, and that he'd done it without my knowledge or consent. I called him Saturday morning. "I need you to come out to the house," I said. "Just you. Some financial paperwork I could use a second set of eyes on." "Of course, Walt. Is it your health? You sound—" "I'm fine," I said. "Just paperwork. Come alone." The 2 TBI agents arrived before 9 and positioned themselves in the back bedroom. A recording device sat in my breast pocket, small enough to disappear under the fabric. At 9:57, his truck pulled into the driveway. He sat inside it for a moment before climbing out, checking his phone, composing himself. He came to the door, and I opened it before he knocked. He dressed carefully, pressed shirt, no jacket, a man performing relaxed. I poured him coffee and sat across from him at the table. "I've been going through some documents this week," I said, "getting organized. I found something that confused me. A home equity line of credit. $265,000 drawn against the house." I paused. "Do you know anything about that?" The muscle along his jaw tightened and released. He talked for 11 minutes. I let him go. He'd rehearsed a shape of this conversation, a version in which he was a desperate man who'd made a terrible mistake, who'd planned to repay everything, who'd never meant for me to be hurt. The real estate project had collapsed. The accounts were empty. The debt had come at the same time as medical bills he hadn't expected. He'd needed a bridge. He'd meant it as temporary. "When did you plan to tell me?" I asked. "Soon," he said, "when I had a repayment plan." "And the life insurance," I said. "Adding your name as joint primary." "I didn't authorize that." Something closed down behind his eyes. "And the prescription," I said. The color left his face all at once. "Someone called my pharmacy 11 weeks ago," I said. "Requested my metoprolol be raised to 4 times my current dose. At my age, on my cardiac history, that level could cause a stroke, a fall. It would look like a 4-year-old man's health giving out." I kept my voice level. The pharmacist flagged it. Nobody ever called to confirm. He said nothing. He was looking at the table, understanding that the room around him had changed. "I wasn't, Walt. I wasn't trying to." His voice had gone thin. "I looked it up. I thought it would slow you down, keep you from noticing things while I sorted it out. I wasn't trying to." "You were trying to keep me confused long enough to finish," I said. The bedroom door opened. Both TBI agents walked into the kitchen. He stood up fast enough to knock the chair back. Then he looked at me, and whatever he'd been about to say didn't come out. "Kevin Rhodes," the female agent said. "We're with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. We have a warrant for your arrest on charges of wire fraud, identity theft, elder financial exploitation, and fraudulent impersonation of a licensed prescriber." He looked at me for a long moment. "Sarah didn't know about the prescription," he said. "I need you to know that. She didn't know what I did." They let him out. His truck sat in my driveway while their car disappeared down the road. I sat at the kitchen table. The coffee had gone cold. Outside, the November wind moved through the bare oak tree Helen had planted the year our daughter was born. My daughter called that night, her voice in pieces I barely recognized. She called me Daddy, which she hadn't done in years. She said she'd known about the money. She'd told herself it was temporary. She'd told herself it wasn't really stealing if they paid it back. She had not known about the prescription. She swore it on her mother's name, and the way she said it told me she was telling the truth. I didn't tell her it was all right. I told her to call a lawyer named Marcus Webb, his number was in my contacts, and to tell him everything, including what she'd known and when, because the only path through this was a straight one. She did. Marcus negotiated her cooperation with the prosecutor's office. Her testimony gave the federal case its backbone: financial records, phone logs, a full timeline of every decision made. She took 18 months and 3 years of probation without asking me to intervene. She didn't ask me for anything except to hear her out. My son-in-law's trial took 8 months. Wire fraud, identity theft, elder financial exploitation, fraudulent prescriber impersonation. The jury was out for less than a day. 14 years federal. When the verdict was read, he looked at the table. He did not look at me. I drove home alone that evening, cooked dinner, and sat at Helen's table. I thought about what 14 years meant for a man his age, thought about what it meant for my daughter, thought about what came next for me, and whether I knew yet. That was 7 months ago. The oak tree in the yard is leafing out again. I sit on the porch most mornings with Cooper, a rescue beagle, 8 months old, from the county shelter in February. He'd been there long enough that his time was running out. He doesn't know that. He knows the squirrel on the fence post is his enemy and that the mail carrier arrives at 11:15. That's sufficient for him. My daughter writes. The early letters were short and careful, like she wasn't sure she still knew the language between us. The last one was 4 pages. She's working with a counselor. She told me she'd stopped constructing reasons for what she'd known and started looking at it directly, that it was harder than she'd expected, that she was doing it anyway. I haven't written back yet. Not because I don't intend to, because I want to say the right thing, and I haven't found it yet. Carl connected me with an elder abuse support group at the senior center in Oak Ridge. I go on Thursdays. I've told my story twice. Both times, someone in the room had a version of their own, a trusted family member, a stretch of unusual helpfulness, paperwork they hadn't reviewed carefully enough, different names, different amounts, the same wound at the center of it. Someone who should have protected them had decided to take from them instead. I don't know if that makes it better or worse, but it makes me useful, which is something. Last month I got a call from a man in Cookville named Robert, 67, retired mechanic, widower. His son-in-law had been helping with finances for 5 months. Strange calls asking where Robert had been. A new name on a joint account Robert didn't remember approving. Am I reading into this? He asked me. Am I being paranoid? Document everything, I told him. Dates, photos, any paperwork you can access. Get a lawyer to review your insurance policies and accounts before you confront anyone. Don't tip your hand until you know the full picture. But it's family, he said. If I'm wrong, if you're wrong, you've done some paperwork and had an uncomfortable conversation, I said. If you're right and you do nothing, you find out the hard way, and by then it's too late to find out anything else. He went quiet. Robert, I said, 7 months ago I was sitting exactly where you are. I want you to still be sitting somewhere a year from now. I gave him Jim Carrey's number in the Tennessee Adult Protective Services line. We talked for 40 minutes. When I hung up, I felt the particular lightness that comes from doing the right thing with what happened to you, from turning wreckage into something someone else can use. My daughter's last letter is on my desk. I've read it 3 times. She ends it the same way she used to end phone calls when she was a teenager. Love you, Daddy. I know you know that. I haven't decided yet what gets rebuilt between us and what doesn't. The version of her that comes out of all this is still becoming. Maybe there's something honest worth building on the other side. Maybe the break goes too deep, and we find a different kind of peace, cordial, careful, never quite what it was. I don't have that answer yet, and I've stopped pretending I need to. What I have is this house, and Cooper, and Thursday mornings in Oak Ridge, and the oak tree in the yard, and the knowledge that when it mattered, I chose clearly. People say a parent never stops loving their child. I believe that's true. But I learned the difference between loving someone and trusting them, and I learned it the hard way with a camera hidden in a smoke detector pointed at my safe, installed by a man I'd let into my home. They say blood is thicker than water. After everything, here's what I'd add. Conscience is thicker than both. If something in this story found you, if you recognized it, Or if you know someone who needs to hear it, share it with them. Leave a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from. Subscribe so you don't miss the stories that matter. You never know which one arrives at exactly the right moment for exactly the right person. Thank you for listening.